This is the story of British Airways 009 on June 1978. That flight was in the air over the Atlantic Ocean between Montreal and London when suddenly they lost all of their hydraulics, their engine controls, and their indicator. The Boeing 747-200 was to fly to London, but it would make one stop along the way. At some point during the flight, the pilots noticed that the outside temperature was wrong. It said minus 68 degrees Celsius, which didn't make any sense because they should have been at about minus 55 degrees Celsius. They realized that the wrong formula had been used for the outside temperature. So the pilots knew that they had to do something fast if they wanted to land the plane. Luckily, the pilots managed to get one of the hydraulic systems back online. They also managed to turn the generator back on, meaning that they had limited electrical power. They also managed to turn the engine indicators back on, but it was touch and go whether or not they would make it. The pilots calculated a new one and set the correct temperature. A small electrical fault had taken out several key systems on the plane. Even though the pilots had no idea how to fix the problem, they had managed to play the odds in their favor, and they had come out on top. They were shocked to see that nothing was wrong with the plane. I repeat, nothing. They had checked every single system on the plane, and it was all working perfectly fine. If you think that you're losing control of the plane, then in your mind you are losing control of the plane. You see, this exact thing had happened to a plane almost 2 decades earlier, just like in the case of British Airways 009. The pilots of that flight had no idea why the plane was behaving so erratically. They also thought that they were losing control of the plane when in reality they still were in control. On November 9th, a British South American Airways 707 was flying from London to New York when the pilots realized that they were losing control of the plane. The pilots had no idea why the plane was doing this. They tried everything they could think of, but nothing worked. They too believed that they were losing control of the plane. But in the end, they had managed to convince the plane to land smoothly in Belgium. Thankfully, the pilots of Flight 009 had been well trained in dealing with emergencies. This meant that even though they were losing control of the plane in their minds, they were actually still in control. If you think that you're losing control of the plane, then in your mind you're losing control of the plane. They never panicked, and instead they talked their way out of the situation. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe, but if you think clearly and talk your way through the problem, you'll most likely come out on top. They had managed to talk their way out of this impossible situation. The indicators had been showing the pilots accurate data the whole time. All of the systems were working just as they should have been. But how? Had the plane flown with no hydraulics, no engine controls, and no lights? Well, the answer to that question surprised everyone. These systems were important for controlling the plane. And so the pilots had no choice but to put the plane into a very risky situation. The pilots talked to each other and came up with a plan. Well, it turned out that the pilots had made a small mistake early on in the flight. Remember when I told you that the pilots fixed the temperature problem early on in the flight? Well, when they did that, they accidentally engaged the anti-ice system. This caused a small electrical surge in the plane. The surge had actually knocked out the main hydraulic pump. However, none of the systems on the plane had malfunctioned. It was the pilots who had misidentified the problem. They thought that they were losing hydraulic pressure when in reality they had just lost the output from the main pump. This also affected the engine instruments. They thought that the engines weren't getting oil when in reality the oil levels were perfect. The pilots of Flight 009 had somehow convinced themselves that they were losing control of the plane, when in reality they were still in control. Both pilots headed towards the cockpit and looked out of the front windows. Everyone on board the plane sighed a breath of relief. They had made it. But this landing was far from normal. The plane had landed with its landing gear partially retracted. Also, the plane had landed without flaps. and the pilots hadn't even used the thrust reverser. Somehow the plane had landed safely despite all of these setbacks. The pilots struggled to put the plane on the right path. Things weren't looking good. They were 30 nautical miles away from the runway, and they were fast losing altitude. They were dangerously close to terrain. The pilots struggled to keep the plane in the air and on course, but it seemed like they might just pull it off. One pilot said, "We must land this aircraft somehow. We can't stay airborne forever." With that, the pilots put the plane into a left bank and headed towards the runway. The plane would stop in the Azores, Portugal, before heading back to London. There was a total of 139 people on board the plane, 123 passengers and 16 crew members. This meant that the pilots had no control over the plane at all. After the plane landed, the pilots were asked, "How did you manage to land the plane?" The pilots simply shrugged their shoulders and replied, "We don't know." The pilots had done everything they could think of to land the plane, but nothing worked. In the end, they just let the plane basically land itself. The autopilot wasn't working either. They were falling from the sky. But how did this happen? And how did everyone survive? Let's find out! The pilots turned around and headed towards the Azores, but that's when they started losing things. Air traffic control tried their best to help the pilots of Flight 009, but there was only so much that they could do. ATC told them to head towards the nearest airport, but the pilots couldn't really do that since they had no control over the plane. ATC wanted the pilots to conserve as much energy as possible by keeping the engines going, but that was an option since the plane was slowly starting to lose altitude, and they didn't want to waste precious fuel. First, they lost their hydraulic power. This means that they couldn't control their elevators, ailerons, or rudder. Then they lost their engine controls, and then their indicator lights went out. They even lost their autopilot. Essentially, they had lost control of the plane. On June 1969, British Airways 009 left Montreal at 7:24 p.m. Eastern Time. As the plane flew over the Atlantic, everything seemed fine until the plane reached its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet or 11,000 meters. But shortly after that, things started to go very wrong. The pilots immediately put out a mayday, meaning that they were in grave danger and needed help fast. By now, the plane had made it to the Azores, but they still had no control over the plane. They asked the airport in the Azores to turn on all of their runway lights so that they could try and land the plane. When the plane got closer to the airport, both pilots abandoned their stations to try and land the plane. At 9:54 p.m. local time, the plane touched down safely. Emergency vehicles rushed to the scene just in case, but thankfully, nobody had been injured. But what had caused this in the first place? Well, that was actually quite simple. In the end, though, the pilots had managed to talk their way through the problem. After the plane had landed, engineers went over the plane with a fine-tooth comb trying to figure out what had happened. So why had the pilots thought that they were losing control of the plane? This goes to show how sometimes your brain can play tricks on you. But why does this story seem so familiar? In that case, the problem had been that the pilots had inadvertently turned off the main fuel valve. Both of these cases are prime examples of how your mind can play tricks on you. What is amazing about these stories is that even though the pilots had no idea what was causing the problem, they still managed to solve the problem. Thank you for watching this episode. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help us grow.